Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk on responses and recommendations to the open letter, whereby open letter, we mean the anonymous open letter to the LSA regarding Steven Pinker that was submitted last summer, or TOL for short sometimes. Now, just briefly in terms of background, to bring us all up to speed, this petition argued that public statements made by Pinker are inconsistent with the anti-racist values that our organization espouses. Now, today in this presentation, we won't go into the content of the letter as much. It had two concrete requests. One was to remove Pinker's status as a fellow of the LSA, and the other was to remove him from the list of media experts that was then on the LSA's website. This letter was signed in a very brief span of time by over 600 linguists, and it got a lot of coverage in mainstream media, and it generated a lot of debate within the field. So just to be clear, when I say a lot of coverage in mainstream media, I mean headlines and articles and interviews like these, so you can have a brief look. All these references are available in our online appendix, which we link to. And when we say media, we really mean almost every major outlet you might think of. So what we want to do today is talk a bit more about the aftermath. We're concerned about the aftermath. We feel like some important positions haven't been considered fully or properly. We're not the authors of the letter ourselves. That is an anonymous group. But what we want to talk about today is two things. One, responses. We want to analyze responses to the letter a bit outside the field, but that'll lead us to talk about responses within the field and give a few recommendations that'll basically be about suggesting ways for each of us to examine our own power within the field, which will bring us towards a kind of kinder, more inclusive linguistics. So let's talk about responses first. In our analysis, we found two kinds of responses. One is distortions of the actual facts, and the other is internal attempts to restore the peace. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. The mainstream media coverage, which, as we've already noted, was substantial, echoed three false claims which we've identified in our analysis. We refuted these in a recent manuscript, which some of you might have already seen. We will recap them here briefly to set the record straight. The first was the claim that the letter was rejected. Here's a tweet from Pinker about the LSA repudiating this. And this was a repeated claim that he made, that the LSA did not accept or rebuffed the letter. And this was repeated uncritically in the media. And it's very easy to show that this claim is false. You just look at the assertion to the contrary in the LSA's message to its membership. We've emphasized here, despite alternative interpretations placed on a message from the executive committee, it was not intended to be a rejection of the open letter. So that's false, but it has persisted in media coverage. The second claim is that support for the letter was insignificant. So here's another public statement from Pinker saying that the signatories to the letter are junior, they're not representative of the field. And that is also false. So when we conducted a breakdown of signatories by academic rank, we found that the makeup of signatories basically mirrors that of LSA membership. And also, if you try and see whether people, so this is representative, and if you try and check whether the signatories are junior, and you need to set up some kind of metric for that, we also find that the signatories include 7 fellows of the LSA. And you can find similar counterpoints and refutations in a piece by Barrère and another work we link to. Now, right now, we're just refuting this false empirical claim that support was insignificant. We can speculate separately later about, why you might want to say that support for by junior people is not important, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So, second claim, false as well. The third claim is that the letter was an attempt to cancel Pinker under, whatever representation of cancel culture you might have. So here's one example in a tweet by a supporter of his that this was meant to destroy his life and livelihood. So this is a framing of the open letter that that Pinker promoted. We already saw the headlines and the interview screen caps from earlier. One problem is that this framing ascribes intent to the authors of the letter without any evidence for it. What it did do, and this is something we were able to show in our analysis and in the appendix to our paper, is that it allowed followers and supporters of Pinker to misconstrue the letter as a demand for material damage. Though you'll recall these weren't the actual requests of the open letter. So in our manuscript, we analyze the discursive tactics that allowed this false narrative to take hold. Here are three main tactics we've identified. The first is obfuscation. So we can see this easily in the first claim that the letter was rejected, which is false. And this relied on relevance implicatures and negative strengthening. So basically, if you play just right with negation, with what it means to accept or not accept something, to reject or not reject something, you can get the inferences that you want to get. The second is ad hominem attacks. So we see this in the second claim, right, that support was insignificant or marginal. And as I already mentioned, we also saw that this enabled personal attacks on the signatories. Again, these have been documented now. The third tactic is perhaps the most complex. This is how different variants on a theme combine to kind of drown the discourse with a certain overarching theme. So all three of the claims that we saw previously relied on overlapping statements, which together fabricated this feeling of persecution as though Pinker was being persecuted. And one way to see this relatively clearly is if you just look at the language and the metaphors in the anti-letter discourse, which use repeated allusions to violence and authoritarian regimes. So you have things like defenestration, shots fired, calling the signatories zealots, and so on. So again, for further details about this, you can see our manuscript and the different appendices that we've assembled. So that's the first kind of response, distortion of the facts. They can be thoroughly refuted, they have been thoroughly refuted, and yet they still dominated the media coverage. And that brings us to looking within the field, a second kind of response, the well-intentioned attempts to restore the peace, which we think fell short. The most important here is the LSA's actual response to these events, which transpired fairly quickly. And we identify a couple of issues with it. The first is that it was slow and equivocal. So we have a quote here from one of the statements saying, "It is not the mission of the society to control the opinions of its members, nor their expression." And this is almost a truism in a society such as ours. But it does not actually address directly the events that happen. And we know from talking to different people that some of our peers who were not aware of the events got this message and did not have any context for it. Again, relevant here is that these events all transpired fairly quickly. We have a timeline in our manuscript, and a lot of this happened on social media. The other problem was that the LSA's response did not publicly challenge the false claims that I just showed you, even though these were repeated in media coverage. And so that allowed these claims to dominate the narrative. So we don't exactly know what the strategy of the LSA leadership was at the time. It wasn't shared with us. If it was to minimize attention for whatever reason, we believe it backfired. Now, there are a couple of other responses within the field, which we often get asked about, including the editorial process for manuscript at language. So let's mention them briefly. We don't want to dwell on them too much. The first is a critical response to the open letter by Barbara Partee in a Medium post. And it basically concluded that the arguments in the letter can be dismissed or attributed to misunderstandings. We feel that this kind of response really encapsulates the kind of rift, if you will, that we found in the field. For one camp of linguists, the letter raised important systemic issues, linking them to an individual. The other camp essentially thought that this was overblown and there wasn't anything wrong, we could just move right along. And we think that this response might have also overshadowed alternative analyses that other linguists proposed. So especially those who argued that there's more to discuss than just the examples mentioned in the letter. We link to contributions by Adger, Borrell, Yasipova, Green, Red, and Snyder in the appendix. The second of these two very field internal contributions was a Facebook post by Jacobson, Partey, and Pisetsky, also known as PPJ. And this was explicitly envisioned as an act of support for the authors and signatories of the letter, while at the same time disagreeing with the content of the letter. Now, it seems to us that by not engaging with the content of the letter, it sidestepped the actual fundamental issues. Instead, it basically just asks to restore the peace. Right? So we have a call for calm, which is not address the source of discord or call for any concrete action. And as a reminder, if you call for civility, you're essentially maintaining the status quo. And if you're maintaining the status quo, you're enforcing and implicitly promoting the existing power hierarchies. So that's how we found that these two kinds of field internal reactions ultimately fell short. They did not tackle the core issues. They muddled discussion within the field. And as we saw, they enabled coverage outside the field, which was false, attributed false things to our field, attributed false statements to the then president of the LSA. Okay, so much for taking stock of where we were and setting the record straight. How do we go forward? So after the first part of the talk, where we set the record straight and gave you a brief, an overview, if you will, of the analysis that we have to responses to the letter within the field. Now we want to challenge the field, which is also ourselves, to draw lessons going forward. And we're going to use two recent controversies to frame this part of the discussion, so not Pinker related. Where this will lead us is, again, to urging everyone to become aware of the power we possess and how we wield it. So let's start with two recent examples. The first is what we think as an example of thoroughly unacceptable communication. This is a recent screed in the guise of a scientific paper. This is a manuscript uploaded to an online repository. It's about gender in German, but what it represents is a case of a senior figure in the field punching down on people who have less social and academic power than him. And I have a few quotes here, which I'll just pick a few bits out of. None of this counts as innocent scientific conversation. And this is not something that should just be accepted as science for its so-called merits to be debated. Here's one quote. From my personal experience as a professor at a university, I learned there's a strong correlation between the insistence on gendering and the length of your research bibliography and your bibliometric index. Footnote 4 claims that gender and gendered language is sexist language, thereby essentially ignoring everything we know about sexism, about gender as a social construct, about the use of language in society. And the whole thing is just riddled with phrases like these on the right, of a monkey business and the gendering rage provoking by the bustling genders and so on. Right? So we don't think this is acceptable. And if you see something like this happening and you have some power to intervene, but you're not stepping in, you're not helping. Now, stepping in doesn't have to be making some kind of public statement and calling the person out. Calling in, right, a private message from someone that a person like this trusts or respects can be, and often is, much more effective. But if you're not doing anything to intervene, you're legitimizing this and you're not helping. And you might ask, what power do I have? And we'll return to that in a moment. The second example we want to give is much more nuanced, and it really now isn't about the individuals as such. Right, so this is a recent case where a PhD student in a North American institution made a joke on Twitter about a prominent linguist. And then two senior academics replied on Twitter and called the student out. And then another PhD student chimed in, claiming that this kind of public reaction is not appropriate. And one of the senior academics then doubled down, and there was a back and forth about this. So again, the point right now is not to pass judgment. Instead, what we'd like to encourage everyone to do is view this kind of thing through the lens of power hierarchies, right? So, what influence do people have on one another based on their academic rank, the stage in their career, the institution they're in, and so on and so on. So how do we actually make some progress? Well, here's where we are with this. Some of us are working on a chapter on this, and we'd also appreciate your feedback and your thoughts. So what have we learned, first of all, from the open letter and events such as the ones we just mentioned? Well, we think that as institutions, the field must be unapologetic in supporting its junior scholars, and it has to be unapologetic in correcting the way that we, the field, are portrayed in the media. Right? So we saw there was a lot of media coverage of the open letter, and it was all very good for one specific distorted narrative. That's not the situation we want to have. But continuing from this, as individuals, we think it's time to rethink and update the norms we've all been socialized with as people and as academics. So power hierarchies and power differentials mean that everyone has both more or less and less power than they might realize. So we're all cogs in machines, and we're limited in what we can change, but there are things we can change. And we all occupy spaces where we have the power to reinforce or challenge existing norms and existing discourses. Power differentials also mean that different strategies are available to each person. What we want to do is find the power that we have to reshape the field into one where everyone has what some scholars have called ambient belonging. So where people of all backgrounds and career stages feel welcome. So that's a suggestion which we'll try and make a little bit more concrete in the next couple of slides, that everyone should evaluate their own power and influence, and in so doing, act to increase inclusion towards a kind of Big Tent linguistics. Here's some examples of what this might look like. And again, we're developing this. We're happy to hear your thoughts as well. So if you're senior faculty, you can avoid talking over junior faculty in department meetings and in meetings with them. You can use your power to challenge the injustices within the field. You can avoid preaching conformity, right? Don't defend the status quo as a reflex without considering who is harmed by the status quo. But junior faculty can also do things, right? We can be aware of the needs of PhD students and the needs of adjunct faculty, for example, and we can support them. No faculty, least of all senior members, should attack or belittle students. And of course, there are many other intersecting considerations. So white linguists such as ourselves cannot ignore the voices of minoritized populations. And the list goes on and on, right? Each of us has more power than someone else in the field. What the field is also very broad, right? Linguistics is not limited only to linguists working within academia. What we want to do is ensure that we don't use that power in ways that are detrimental to others. We want to actively support and improve the experience of others. So, to wrap up, we talked about responses and recommendations in the aftermath of the open letter. What we showed is that many of the responses to the open letter were either false, that's mostly outside of the field, outwith the field, as we say here, or unsatisfactory. Those were the responses within the field, or at least the most prominent ones. The open letter did start or continue an important conversation within the field. And we know that our society is in the process of implementing some steps that were recommended by the task forces, which were set up in response to the open letter, right? So the letter worked. It was very important and it worked, but that conversation has to continue in constructive ways. We made a few recommendations of our own as to how that might happen. So we want a linguistics which is kind, especially to those of us who have less institutional power. That's why we've invited colleagues at all career stages to consider the influence that they, we, you, have on others and our present positionality. So take action to make improvements where you see injustice. And by all means, do choose your battles, right? We have limited capacities and limited energy. Choose your battles, but choose some. So we're very excited to continue this conversation. We're happy to hear how you would move our field towards a kinder linguistics and what your thoughts are. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and you can find us in all of the places where you can find conversations around and throughout this conference. All right, thanks.